ahead. Right. After that technological interruption, hi there. My name is Paul Eggleton with Microsoft, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about devtool. Hopefully, you've seen a little bit of it earlier on in the day, which is good. So it's not completely new. This session was going to be a hands-on, but we didn't quite have time with all the interesting content that we wanted to do. So I've kept the hands-on in the rest of the slides, and you should be able to follow it either, depending on whether the dev day setup persists afterwards on that setup, or you can fairly easily, with the instructions that are in the slides, just download a copy of Yocto project sources and run on your own machine. So a little bit about me. I've been working with the Yocto project for quite some time and open embedded as well. And I'm actually the original author of devtool. So if it doesn't work in the way you expect, then you can obviously blame me. But I must stress that since that time, there have been lots of contributions from other folks in the community. It's been excellent, and it's kind of taken a little bit of a life of its own, as these things do. So thanks to all those people. And also, I'll have to say that a lot of the material I'm presenting today is courtesy of Trevor, who you saw earlier today. He originally wrote this, and I just tweaked it just a little bit. So, what actually is devtool? So it's kind of a Swiss Army knife set of tools for working on recipes and the associated source tree. So we saw devtool add just in the last presentation for creating a new recipe corresponding to some source tree that you've got, or an upstream package, software package. devtool edit recipe lets you quickly bring up your favorite editor on a recipe file. We also have devtool upgrade that's capable of automatically upgrading a recipe to a new upstream version as best as possible. And devtool finish is part of the workflow to put your changes back into the recipe, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, and many more. So on the next slide, we've got a few others. devtool modify is another really important one. If you have an existing recipe and you want to work on the source tree in an environment which devtool's providing you to make it easy to do that, then that's your starting point. devtool deploy target and undeploy target, that you put your built application onto a target device and take it off. And devtool build and build image, a couple of helper wrappers around Bitbake that make things just a little bit easier. So, I mean, by and large, really, devtool exists to just make the exercise of working with recipes and sources just that little bit easier. So hopefully that they actually do that. So why does devtool exist? Why did we originally write it? So our build system is its sort of best capability is to do repeatable builds from source. So it'll automatically download the sources, configure, patch, configure, build, install, package, and then right up to the image. But when it comes to working with the source of some particular package that you want to modify, it's not really itself particularly helpful for that, or at least it wasn't. So you might, if you start poking around the work directory for a particular recipe, you'll notice that the sources are right there. Might be in a Git subdirectory, or the name of the package or source or something like that. And so you think, hey, well, I'll just go and edit those, and then I'll run Bitbake, and unfortunately that won't cause it to pick up those changes. You'll have to force the build. If any change you make, you basically have to force it each time. If you want to generate a patch, it's all completely manual. And in the worst case, it's not actually that difficult to wipe out all of your changes if you do, say, for example, bitbake -c clean on that recipe. Bitbake, because it's managing that source tree, it will quite unceremoniously just delete it and leaving you with however much work that you had in there just totally wiped out. So that source tree is managed by the build system. You should probably avoid touching it. So we need a better way to do that, where you get your own source tree to do your work in and go from there. Also, we wanted to help newer users add software to the build system who perhaps just need that quick starting help. So yeah, I call out the ESDK here. I've been mentioning that a few times in here. I'm not actually covering it in great depth, but luckily, I've got some resources that you can go and look at. So just to quickly cover a few past presentations that we've done. DevTool's not new, so luckily it's been covered quite well in the past. Tim did a presentation back in 2017, which was really good. And then Henry also did a presentation specifically on the extensible SDK, which was also good. It's probably worth just quickly mentioning the extensible SDK, explaining what it is. So extensible SDK basically wraps up the build environment into an installable package, but pre-configured. So you never run Bitbake directly. Your sole interface to building things is through devtool. You also get paths into the cross compiler and that sort of thing, just like your traditional SDK, if you need to. So it's sort of exposing the power of some of these tools to perhaps people who don't want to go and set up the full build environment. So maybe your application developers who are not already steeped in building operating systems. So, and yeah, and ELC 2018 had a Linux kernel presentation by Sean that also used devtool. And the Yocto Project Dev Day, we did a few presentations as well, and of course, let's not forget Trevor's presentation earlier. He was exercising devtool, and Rudy's as well. So documentation, it's fairly well covered in the documentation. There is a slight quirk in that the in-depth devtool documentation is to be found in the SDK manual. This is sort of a little bit of a battle we've had, is to try and avoid duplication. So don't be confused by that. Hopefully, the instructions that you find in the SDK manual about using devtool are completely applicable to using devtool next to the build system. So just have a look there, and the links are in the slides. And we've got other references around the place to devtool as well, including specifically for kernel. So devtool, unlike most command line tools, has pretty extensive built-in help. And if you run devtool -help, you'll see the standard command line options that apply to everything. So it's a little bit like Git in that it has the main devtool command, and it has sub commands for doing various things, which we kind of alluded to already. So yeah, I cut the bottom of this off because it's obviously quite long. There are many sub commands. So if you want more help on a specific command, devtool add, for example, -help, will tell you how to run that and various options. Yeah, devtool add is kind of interesting in that, so we're creating a new recipe a sort of a starter recipe, I'll say, based upon some source tree or some tarball or a get tree, really anywhere that has the sources. And then it's kind of worth knowing what happens after that. So it's generating the recipe, but it's also setting up the source tree, if you aren't specifying a local path, to be a Git tree. So that makes it easy for you to see if you subsequently make changes to the sources. Your Git will make those easy to see, just to give you Git status or whatever, and you can generate patches, make an entire patch series if you want. So yeah, you're not you're never going to be confused as to where you are, hopefully. So there are actually two modes to DevTool. There's probably the one that I would concentrate on most, the one that most people will see, especially based upon what we've seen already today, is when you're running outside the ESDK, so Bitbake mode as it's referred to here. There is a slight difference between that and the ESDK, and I've got those that enumerated here. I'll cover this a bit later, but the reason we do this is in the ESDK, DevTool is your only interface to the extra functionality that the build system provides. So we have to expose a little bit of that, and also a few other sort of utilities that are helpful within the ESDK context. So they have no relevance next to Bitbake. So this chart just gives you a little bit of idea of when the various bits of functionality in DevTool were introduced. As you can see, it's been around for quite some time now. In the past, we had a bit of trouble because when DevTool was new, because of for various reasons, vendor BSPs and pre-existing software and other restrictions, people might have been pinned to an earlier version and therefore they didn't have DevTool, they didn't have certain bits of DevTool functionality. Now that's not really a problem, but if you are using the older versions, then you can see that certain bits of it wouldn't necessarily be available, but it's now established enough that the core functionality is available in most versions that you would pick up today. And why does the ESDK get the extra features? Well, we've kind of covered that. So in the ESDK, you don't have, you can't really run Bitbake directly. So DevTool provides a little bit of a window into that, at least just the stuff that's really needed. So the main thing to be aware of with DevTool really is the workspace. So the workspace is a layer. It is created automatically whenever you run devtool add or devtool modify or any of the subcommands that where it's going to need the workspace. So you don't actually need to explicitly create it yourself. It will be done for you. So it's a layer in the traditional Yocto sense, but it's kind of it's the working area rather than a layer that you would publish directly to somewhere like all the other layers. So so you do your work on the layer, on the recipes in the layer when they're being managed by DevTool, and on the source tree, which would also appear by default, at least under the workspace. And then when you're finished, your recipe can go back into your layer if it indeed needs to be moved there in the case of devtool add. So here, and in this, and sorry, we're talking target as your target device. It could be a real machine or a QEMU instance. So hopefully the concept of layers is not new by this time of the day. So in Bitbake mode, you can see this gives you some idea of how the various commands interact with the workspace and the target. So your starting points are, again, modify, upgrade, or add. And they are putting something into the workspace, or we consider the recipe kind of goes into the workspace even if the recipe file doesn't itself go in there. So one question that people sometimes ask is it possible to deal with multiple targets? Say devtool deploy target. So deploy target will put your, as I mentioned earlier, will put the, say you've done devtool modify and then made some changes to your source tree, or devtool add and it's created a recipe, and you've run Bitbake and built it. Everything looks okay to move on to the next step, which is to try and test it on your target. So devtool deploy target will do that over SSH, and so can you use multiple targets? So yes, you can. The information about the deployed files, say your executables or whatever, is actually which files get in, have been installed, is actually stored on the target itself in this hidden file. So if you were to then deploy target to a different machine, it's going to treat it as if the files are not there, and so it'll install them again. If you were then to pick up an old, an existing device and you do undeploy target, it's going to know exactly what it needs to pull out and then deploy target again, and you'll get the result that you expect. Yes, so I mentioned here you'd specify your target's IP, deploy target and undeploy target, to specify which target you're interested in. So can you have multiple workspaces? So technically you can, but you can only really use one at a time, so you wouldn't normally do this. You can really have as many recipes as you want in the workspace, and because you're not really generally exposing the workplace to anyone else, there isn't need to have more than one. You can actually export the workspace if you've kind of got work in progress that you want to give to other people, so that is functionality is available. But for most purposes, you don't need it. It's just really you would only explicitly create the workspace in a separate location if you wanted to move it somewhere rather or have it somewhere you preferred rather than the default location. So a bit of a sidebar on recipe tools. So you may have seen in Rudy's presentation, if you looked at the recipe created by devtool add, that it mentioned recipe tool at the start. So recipe tool is actually the tool which is in charge of creating that sort of starter recipe. And so it contains a bunch of logic for figuring out what, how to build a given source tree. So it looks for 7 key files and then tries to unpack what's in those files and work out what build commands might be needed or what classes the recipe would need to inherit, or all of those sorts of things. So yeah, if you're looking for how that works, if you're looking for the code for that, if you're looking to extend it, then you would be looking for recipe tool and not devtool. Devtool add, at least that part of it is all done by recipe tool. It actually contains a few other interesting things as well. It's worth looking at for creating and updating BPFN files. So if you want to customize the recipe in your own layer, particularly if you wanted a script doing that, then yeah, recipe tool would be the place to look for that. Or programmatically set variables and recipes. It can do a few other interesting things like that. So check that out. So I've got through things fairly quickly, actually, more quickly than I expected. So what would we be perhaps doing in future with devtool? So I think at this stage, devtool is fairly mature. So there are, at least as far as I can see there may not be too many sort of big ticket feature items that we would add. I mean, anybody can feel free to correct me on that, but there are a few things missing and a few rough edges we can still round off. So multi-config support is currently missing, and we'll definitely be working on that. And one slight sort of issue that does happen, particularly with devtool upgrade, is just one of the main things that devtool upgrade is doing, of course, is changing those references in recipes to match the upstream version. So that requires it to not really do a search and replace. I mean, it does try and parse the recipe and then insert or update values in the appropriate locations. But sometimes with the sort of the wild nature of some of our metadata, it can do the wrong thing at times. So we can definitely make that logic a bit smarter. So that's something I would definitely like to see us do. And additionally, perhaps for devtool add, it would also be nice if recipe tools a bit smarter in terms of understanding new technologies and things like that. I mean, perhaps building Rust, or we in the sort of, I suppose a few years ago we added Node.js support. That's been sort of, I don't think we 100% covered that, but you know, that's a sort of example of things we could do with recipe. And yeah, feel free to send your ideas, or even better, send patches to add new things. So conclusion, follow the hands-on if you're interested in getting your hands dirty with this. There are a bunch of exercises you can go through and get to grips with how it works if you haven't already. Try it out in your own source trees. devtool add, just point to a random piece of software and see how well it works or doesn't, as the case may be. And devtool modify, if you've got a definitely, if the exercise you have in front of you is to make changes to a source tree for a particular recipe that already exists, then devtool modify is definitely where I would suggest that you start, and that will give you the environment that makes it easier to do that. And obviously, as we mentioned, devtool upgrade for changing to a new upstream version. And yeah, refer to the documentation links that we've got here and other presentations. Yeah, so please send feedback. The usual places, your project mailing list, IRC, or you can email me directly if you like.